My daughter loves honey on her toast every morning, has for years, and a couple weeks back she asked me a simple question while she was spreading it. Dad, honey just comes from bees, right? It's just honey. And I had to stop and think about how to answer her honestly, because the bottle in her hand, the same kind sitting in most kitchens in this country, almost certainly wasn't just that. When I explained it to her plainly, the way I'm about to explain it to you, she got quiet, and then she actually teared up a little, because to a kid, finding out something you trusted completely turned out to be watered down and hidden from you feels like a real betrayal, even when it's just breakfast. My name's Volter. I farm for a living, and I keep bees on part of my land. Real hives, real honey, nothing added, nothing taken out. So I know exactly what pure honey is supposed to look like, taste like, and behave like, and I know exactly how far some of what's sold as honey in a regular grocery store has drifted from that. I want to walk you through what's actually happening in this industry, because it's a bigger problem than almost anyone realizes. And then I'll tell you exactly what to look for, so you're not the last one at the table to find out. Here's the rule, the only rule that's ever mattered for honey. Real honey needs exactly one ingredient. Honey, that's it. Bees collect nectar, break it down with enzymes, reduce the moisture content by fanning it in the hive, and cap it in wax once it's ready. Nothing gets added. Nothing needs to be added. It's one of the only foods on earth that occurs naturally, complete, with a shelf life measured in centuries if it's stored properly. Archaeologists have found genuinely edible honey in Egyptian tombs thousands of years old. That's how stable real honey is on its own, with zero preservatives, because it never needed any. So here's the problem, laid out plainly. Honey is expensive and slow to produce. Real honey takes healthy hives, good weather, and time nobody can rush. And it's one of the most targeted foods in the world for what the food safety industry actually calls honey laundering. There are two separate tricks being played here, and once you understand both, you'll never look at a honey bear the same way again. The first trick is dilution. Cheap sugar syrups, corn syrup, rice syrup, beet sugar syrup, cane syrup get blended into real honey to stretch the volume while cutting the actual cost of production, because every one of those syrups is dramatically cheaper to produce than genuine honey. An academic review published in Food Bioscience specifically flags rice syrup, corn syrup, inverted sugar, and several others as the most common adulterants used industry-wide. A widely cited, peer-reviewed study out of Australia and New Zealand tested 95 commercial honeys using the internationally accepted carbon isotope method and found 27% showed signs of adulteration with cane or corn syrup. The European Commission's own food fraud network tested 320 honey samples in 2022 and found 46% were suspected of being cut with cheap syrup. This isn't a fringe problem, it's one of the most commonly reported food fraud categories in the entire world, year after year. The second trick is even harder to catch, and it's called ultra-filtration. Real unprocessed honey naturally contains trace amounts of pollen, and the pollen is actually valuable information. It's what lab testing uses to trace exactly where a batch of honey came from, geographically and botanically. Ultrafiltering strips that pollen out entirely under high pressure and heat, and the honey that comes out the other side looks clearer, pours smoother, and sits prettier on a shelf, but it's now essentially untraceable. A widely cited 2011 investigation by Food Safety News tested honey purchased from major U.S. retailers and found that more than 75% had been ultra-filtered to the point where pollen could no longer be detected at all. That's not a small percentage. That's the overwhelming majority of what most people are actually buying, when they grab a plastic honey bear off a regular grocery shelf. Here's why that filtering matters beyond just traceability. Ultra-filtered honey is frequently used specifically to disguise the true country of origin because a lot of honey imported from certain countries faces steep anti-dumping tariffs in the U.S., and honey with the pollen stripped out is much harder to trace back to its actual source, making it easier to relabel and pass off as coming from somewhere else entirely. I want to tell you what I told my daughter after that first question, because this is really the heart of it. When you buy a bottle labeled pure honey and it's actually been cut with rice syrup or corn syrup and had its pollen filtered out to hide where it really came from, you're not just getting a slightly less premium product. You're paying honey prices for something that, by the FDA's own definition of what honey actually is, a product exclusively from bee nectar, legally shouldn't be allowed to carry that name at all. And you're losing the actual reason people reach for real honey in the first place. The trace enzymes, the local pollen, the antibacterial properties, all of which depend on the honey being left alone, not stripped and stretched. So here's what I want you to actually do next time you're standing in that aisle, because there are real checkable signs, even if they're not perfect on their own. Check for the True Source Certified label. It's a third-party certification specifically built to combat honey laundering, verifying the supply chain back to its actual source, and it's one of the only marks on a honey bottle that means something has genuinely been checked rather than just claimed. Look at the price and be suspicious of anything unusually cheap. Real honey production is labor-intensive and slow. There's a floor under what it can honestly cost to produce, and honey priced well below that floor is one of the most reliable red flags there is, because someone, somewhere in that supply chain, cut corners to hit that price. Buy from a local beekeeper if you have one anywhere near you. A farmer's market, a local co-op, a small regional producer. It's genuinely one of the hardest categories to fake because the whole supply chain is short enough that you can often ask the person who actually keeps the hives. Check the ingredient label itself, and this sounds almost too simple, but it works. It should say honey and only honey. If you see the words honey blend, honey sauce, or honey product, or if any other sweetener is listed at all, you're not looking at pure honey, no matter what the front of the jar implies. Look at the texture and behavior. Understanding these home checks aren't perfect on their own, but they're worth knowing. Real raw honey tends to be thick, slow pouring, and will often crystallize into a grainy texture over time sitting in your cabinet. That's actually a sign of purity, not spoilage. And a lot of people wrongly toss out real honey the moment it starts to crystallize. Honey that's been heavily processed and cut with syrup tends to stay perfectly clear and pourable indefinitely, because the process that keeps it looking pretty on a shelf is often the same process that stripped out what made it real in the first place. I want to be fair here because I'm not telling you every clear, smooth honey on a store shelf is automatically fake. Some legitimate honey is lightly filtered without being adulterated with syrup at all. And a lot of large, reputable producers do invest in real testing to verify what they're selling. What I'm telling you is that the odds, based on the actual published testing I just walked you through, are not in your favor if you're grabbing the cheapest bear-shaped bottle without checking anything at all. Here's what I told my daughter after she asked her question, and I think it's worth passing on. I told her real honey is one of the few things in this world that's already perfect, exactly the way nature made it. No factory needs to improve it. And the only reason anyone would need to add something to it is to make more money off less of the real thing. She understood that instantly, and she asked if we could start using the honey from our own hives instead of the bottle from the store, which, if I'm honest, is exactly the answer I was hoping she'd land on herself. I'll leave you with the bigger point because it's the one that keeps coming up no matter what I'm looking into on this channel. Honey might be the purest example of it, a food that needed absolutely nothing done to it to be perfect, and an entire shadow industry built around quietly doing something to it anyway, stretching it, filtering it, hiding where it actually came from, because most people never think to ask. Tell me in the comments what kind of honey is sitting in your kitchen right now. I read every one of these, and I'd genuinely like to know how many of you had no idea about the ultra-filtering issue before today. And if you keep bees yourself or know a good local producer near you, drop the name, because I'd rather build a real list with all of you than assume I've found every honest source myself. Next time I want to walk through the exact same test on maple syrup, because that industry has almost the identical problem hiding behind it. Until then, check the label before you trust the bear-shaped bottle, and remember, if it needs something added to taste sweet, it was never really honey to begin with.